When it comes to choosing the paper for your drawings, there is a lot of choice, and it's really important that you're picking the correct paper as it's literally the foundation for your drawing to go on top of. So today I'm going to share with you everything I've learned about paper over the past 5 years from creating hundreds of realistic drawings so that you know exactly how to pick the perfect paper for your drawings. Right, so the first thing I want to talk about is that you want your paper to be archival, and if you don't know what this means, it's referring to how resistant the paper is to being discolored, because you don't want to do a drawing, put it on a wall, and then a year later that, let's say, a white paper is then turned like a light shade of yellow, because that's just going to detract away from all the hard work that you put into the main subject and make it look a bit eh. And the way that you can tell if a paper is archival is whether or not it's acid free. Now you can almost count on the fact that the more expensive artist grade papers will pretty much always be acid free, but it's the cheaper, lower quality, not necessarily targeted to artist papers that is a bit hit and miss as to whether they are acid free or not. Now before we get on to some more of the specifics about choosing the perfect paper, I just want to walk you through one of the most important factors that I bear in mind when picking just any paper in general, and that is how thick the paper is. And I personally don't like to work on anything that's lower than 200 GSM, and GSM is referring to grams per square meter. And obviously the higher the GSM, the thicker the paper is because it's a lot heavier, and the lower the GSM, the thinner it is because obviously it's a lot lighter. And the reason I've picked 200 GSM as almost the sweet spot is because it's the thickness that you can still really layer any kind of colored pencils, graphite pencils, even ink. And also when you're erasing on top of this paper, because at the end of the day we artists always make mistakes, you don't have that fear that you're going to crimple the paper or just tear a big ass hole in it. And at the end of the day, drawings done on thicker paper just feel way more luxurious, especially when you're holding them in your hands, as they just feel a lot heavier and they hold their shape a lot better. Right, so we now know that we want our paper to be acid free and also relatively thick, but there are still two main things that we really want to look at, and these are texture of the paper and also the color of the paper. So I'm going to start off with the texture, and there are really two main types of texture that paper can have: a rough surface texture, and then you have a smooth surface texture. And I mean, technically you do have varying degrees in between, but we're going to look at these two main ones to keep it nice and simple. So the rough surface texture also goes by the name of like a vellum finish, or even like sketching paper, obviously has a very rough surface. So if you look at it, you can see all these grooves, and this makes it really ideal for like looser gripping materials like charcoals or pastels, where if you were to use those materials on, let's say, smooth paper, they would just kind of slide off, because you do really need those grooves in order to act as like teeth to grab onto that pigment so it doesn't just fall off the page as you're using it. But the rougher paper does have some downsides, especially when using colored pencils or graphite pencils, because these materials are a bit more grippy to the page than charcoal or pastels. They obviously can't get into those grooves as well, so what you end up having is all these little white speckles showing through either the pigment layer or the graphite layer, so you're not able to get a really nice solid finish that you might be after. However, if you are after a far rougher and kind of messier looking drawing, then obviously this rougher paper is ideal for you. But if you do want something that's a bit more realistic and then you can get a bit more of a refined drawing on, I'd highly recommend going for the smoother paper, because obviously the grains to it are a lot shallower and infrequent, so you are able to get a much more solid and saturated finish. But obviously, because this paper doesn't have as many grains, you do run the risk of oversaturating the page very quickly, and this is the point where you can't put any more pigment down, because the pigment that's already down has filled up the few grooves that you actually have on the paper. So what I'd recommend doing instead is working in layers where you're pressing very lightly at first and then really increasing the pressure once you're happy that what you've got down is in keeping with what is on the reference photo. Right, so let's look at picking the correct colored paper for your drawing, and there are really three main colors that you can choose from. The first one being white paper, and this is like the standard color that pretty much everyone is familiar with and is great for a whole host of subjects, whether it's a car, an animal, a person, just really anything. But there is one type of subject that I don't draw onto white paper, and that is white subjects. What I do instead is I draw them onto black paper, and this is because the white subject is going to be a lot more contrasting in comparison to the color of the black paper than it is in comparison to the white paper. Because just think about it, you draw it onto white paper, it will just merge into the color of the white paper, but if you draw it onto black paper, it just really pops and has a lot of presence to it. And black paper is also really fun to play around with because you're almost drawing in reverse. So normally on white paper you're adding in shadows and then building up to the highlights, but with the black paper, because it's black, you already have those shadows, and it's just a case of adding in all the highlights and the midtones. And the final color that we haven't spoken about yet is the toned or tanned paper, and the premise behind these is that you already have the midtones established, so the drawings in theory shouldn't take you as long. However, I don't find this because I still need to cover the entire surface with pigment anyway, because the color that I'm after is never quite the color of the paper. However, the main reason that I ever use toned paper is to really help bring out the highlights of the subject, because obviously those highlights are going to be a lot more contrasting in comparison to the color of, let's say, the toned paper than they would be in comparison to the color of the white white paper, but I wouldn't recommend using the tanned or toned paper for subjects where you don't have those brighter highlights, because they do tend to get pulled back into the color of the piece. Right, so we have covered quite a few things in this video, and I feel it's only fair to finish it off by giving you the recommendations of the paper that I would use, and I'm in no way sponsored or endorsed by any of these paper brands. These are just the things that I use. So the very first one that I'd recommend is Daler and Rowney Smooth Surface Heavyweight Paper. Considering how thick it is, so 220 GSM, and it's also acid free, so it's ticking all the boxes that we've spoken about. And yeah, it's actually really affordable considering how good it is. And I've actually done loads of professional work on this paper, and I'd highly recommend checking it out. But the stuff that I'm currently using is Strathmore Bristol board, and Bristol is referring to the fact that it's multiple layers of paper all obviously stuck together, so it's very thick. So this is actually 270 GSM, so a lot higher than what we spoke about in the video. It's super smooth as well, and yeah, this is the stuff I'm using, and I'm cutting it down dependent on what size drawing I'm working on. So yeah, this is a bit more expensive, but I'd highly recommend checking it out. And in terms of the toned paper, I use Strathmore toned grey paper. Now, unfortunately, it's not the thickest paper in the world. It's 118 GSM, which is pretty flimsy, but just the surface and the smoothness of it is just really, really cool, and I'd recommend checking this out as well. And the black paper I use is called Frisk Black Paper, but again, it is 135 GSM, so not the thickest paper in the world, and I think for my future black paper drawings, I might go get myself some Strathmore black paper, because Strathmore, the paper they make, is just really, really good. So there you go, that was everything I've learned about drawing paper over the past 5 years. I hope you found some things in it useful, and also some of the recommendations, which I'll have linked down below. And if you have enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, and I'll see you in the next one, which will appear on screen right over here. So I shall see you over there.